My name is Robert Tedisco. I said the ladies are experts because they're both special educators. I'm not here tonight as a lawyer. I'm here as someone who has spent 49 years living with ADHD. And I was diagnosed about 15 years ago, and it was a huge turning point in my life. It helped me understand a lot better the pre-diagnosis part of my life. I've become immersed in the disability community. I have sat on a number of boards, CHAD, Children and Adults with Attention Deficit Disorder, their National Board of Directors, ADA's, the Adult Attention Deficit Disorder Association. I've run a nonprofit called the EDGE Foundation, which I'm going to talk about tonight, for a number of years, that provides specialized coaching for high school and college students with ADHD and executive functioning impairment. But for tonight, what we're talking about is stigma. And that is a huge issue for not only for you as parents, but more importantly for your children. Or if you are an adult with a disability, stigma's out there, it's ugly. What do you do about it? And unfortunately, at times when we try to protect our children, what's unfortunate is that in many cases we actually wind up unwittingly perpetuating these stigmas, these social stigmas. And so what I'm going to do is kind of take you through that tonight. I will offer you my perspective and some advice on how to address things proactively. Also, in the area on the side, I've put together just a little handout, which is essentially a glossary of special education terms and some resources, which include the CEC. So it works out well. And also some information about the EDGE Foundation. So let's get started. Stigma. It arises out of and is perpetuated in many cases by fear, lack of accurate information, and that's the biggest problem that we have in the disability community. There's so much information out there. Where do you hear this information? Well, so-and-so says, or they say. You have to be really careful that you're getting accurate science-based information, okay? Traditional biases, that's another problem. Biases against mental health clinicians, people feeling uncomfortable taking their children to a psychiatrist or a psychologist, okay? That is another issue. People having biases about the words special education, or labels like ADHD or bipolar disorder or autism spectrum disorders, okay? Wanting to protect our children, as I said earlier, that a number of times parents will, and I'm going to give you some very specific examples of when parents trying to protect their children from social stigmas will oftentimes actually wind up perpetuating them. And that is a problem that we can address because we're here fighting against stigma. So the last thing we want to do is fight against ourselves. Wanting to protect ourselves as parents. A lot of times parents feel that my child having a disability may be a poor reflection on me as a parent. And so that is another thing that perpetuates this. And also a lot of myths and misconceptions. Okay, myths and misconceptions about ADHD. Number one, it's a willpower issue. Why don't they just do what they're supposed to do, okay? I can tell you, as someone who struggled as a child and really didn't know at that time what it was called. In fact, when I was young, they didn't call it ADD. They called it BAD. They were good kids and they were bad kids, and that's all anyone cared about or knew at the time, okay? And I was actually a loud bad kid. So in Catholic school, that did not go over too well. I can honestly tell you it's very easy as a parent or a teacher to say, why can't you just do what you're supposed to do? And it's just not that easy. And I'm going to explain to you some of the science involved so you can see. I often, as a kid, I have vivid memories of being sent to my room after dinner to do my homework. I wasn't allowed to turn on the television until I finished my homework. I couldn't bring myself to do my homework. I had an hour or two left before I had to go to bed. And I remember just sitting on the floor of my bedroom with this knot in my stomach. If I could have done it, I would have. It was like a paralysis, okay? I wasn't having a party, disobeying. I knew I was going to get in trouble tomorrow when I went to school and I didn't have my assignment with me. I knew when the report card came I was going to get into trouble because my grades were going to reflect that. but I still couldn't move forward. And it was a huge problem. ADHD is traditionally thought of as something that occurs with hyperactive boys, okay? It's an excuse for lazy or bad kids. It's an excuse for bad parenting, something that they grow out of, okay? We're drugging our youth by medicating them. That's another myth that you hear out there. And it's a product of our short attention span, fast-paced society. Don't we all have a little of this ADHD? I can't tell you how many times I've been interviewed on television or on a radio program, and that question gets thrown at me all the time. Now, what is ADHD? First of all, we just talk a little bit about terminology. People think of ADD and what's the difference between ADD and ADHD. ADHD is the blanket umbrella term that refers to what you would traditionally think of as ADD, or ADD with hyperactivity, or the combined type. All of those terms are all nestled under the umbrella of ADHD. It was AD/HD, but they dropped the slash. I don't know who they are, but anyway, this is where we are. Okay, ADHD is a neurobiological disorder affecting the prefrontal cortex of the brain. Now, as a lawyer, what I can tell you is I'm not a doctor. So they teach you in law school, if you're going outside of your field, you got to give a good disclaimer. I'm not a clinician. I have no scientific basis other than my 49 years of working with ADHD and the research that I've done. As I understand it, and I'm sure I'm grossly oversimplifying this, it is a problem with the portion of the brain that regulates executive functioning, okay? And also, there is a dysfunction with the neurotransmitters that supply this area of the brain. Dopamine, the biggest, serotonin, and norepinephrine. Now, executive functioning, what is it? Organization, the part of your brain that organizes anything that you have to organize, okay? Prioritizes. Time perception. A lot of people say people with ADHD have poor time management. That's a gross understatement. When you have an executive functioning impairment, you can't organize anything, okay? Time happens to be a more particularly difficult problem because I think it's a question of time perception. We do not appreciate time in a very real sense. When you have things whizzing around in your head at light speed, there's a huge disconnect between the slow reality of life. And so there's a very huge disconnect between trying to understand accurately how long it's going to take to perform a task, always thinking that you have more time than you do to perform a task. It's a much bigger issue. Okay, impulse control, which is usually the behavioral culprit. These kids know the difference between right and wrong. The problem is they can't fight the impulse to do what seems like a good idea at the time, okay? And that's really where the behavioral issues come in. I know you're not supposed to steal, but the kid next to me in school had the new iPhone on the desk. I had to have it. I couldn't stop myself. Okay, that doesn't mean it's okay, but that is where it comes from. Hyperactivity in some cases, okay? And sometimes hyperactivity can be cognitive hyperactivity. I was being interviewed for the New York Times Sunday magazine a number of years ago about adult ADHD. And I was trying to explain it to the reporter. And I said, you know, you and I are having this conversation, this rational adult conversation, but what you don't see is that there's an amusement park going on in my head right now, and you just can't see that. Attention regulation, and this is really crucial. A lot of parents have come to me and said, what do you mean he can't focus or pay attention? He can play video games for 5 hours, okay? Here's the problem. It's not an inability to pay attention to something. It's an inability to regulate attention. There is either no attention or hyperfocus, and there's no in between, okay? That's really the problem. It goes through extremes. Poor short-term memory, that's something that I suffer for. That's why I'm always losing my keys. That's why I'm never remembering where I parked my car or people's names, because short-term memory, you have to think of your head as like a computer. There's two types of memory. There's random access memory, the desktop in here, and then there's long-term memory, okay? Long-term memory, my wife tells me, is frightening, that it's so accurate, but short-term memory is abysmal. And that is usually a very big problem. Okay, a lot of people think of executive functioning as the conductor of the symphony inside of your head, or the office manager. And when that's down, everything suffers. Okay? Now, everybody in this room learned in science class when you were young that when you put your hand on the stove and it's hot, a signal goes all up your arm to your brain and says, it's hot, move your hand, okay? And so we think of a light bulb that you plug into the wall and the electricity goes through the wire and it turns on. But it's not like that in the human body. It's not one long continuous wire. It's a series of disconnected wires. And what you can see here is those disconnections are met by neurotransmitters that have to be received a certain way, and they continue with the signal. If there is a problem with either the ability to receive those or the production of them or the absorption of them, most notably dopamine for people with ADHD, there is a problem. You can actually see the blockage, okay? It's a neurobiological condition. It has a medical basis. Now, talking about students, okay? ADHD, and while we're talking about stigma tonight, has nothing to do with intelligence, and it has nothing to do with sanity, okay? Every student that I've represented with ADHD, and I can tell you from my own experience as a child, that it has nothing to do with the subject matter for the most part for these kids. You've got a frustrated student that doesn't like doing their work at school, okay? But in addition to that, and this happens when they get to various different transitions in 3rd grade to 4th grade, all of the administrative things that they have to do now get into their lives. Okay, they have to bring different books to different classrooms, okay? They have notebooks that they have to have a different notebook for every class. They have to remember to bring the right book and the right notebook home, okay? They have to remember to have a pen or a pencil. The teachers are telling them, you're not babies anymore. We can't remind you. We don't give out pencils anymore. You have to have your own. Their assignments are due on certain dates. They have to coordinate those, okay? They have to keep track of their papers. I never did homework as a kid. I just didn't do it. I can't tell you how many of my clients have done the work and just haven't turned it in, that it's at the bottom of the locker or scrunched up in the bottom of the desk, okay? Have to remember to bring their lunch or money, okay? All of those administrative tasks are what these kids trip over, and essentially they're tripping over themselves. What's the reality? I told you about the myths of ADHD. Okay, it's not a willpower issue, it's medical. Okay? It's not an excuse for lazy or bad students. And I can tell you a very quick story. When I was young, and I was in 7th grade, I think it was, my father was educated as a teacher in Italy, and he was a math teacher. And my punishment at every report card really hinged on my math grade, okay? And I had about a C plus average, mostly because of homework assignments that were not turned in. We had to take these standardized tests, the tests they tell you can't study for this test, which was fine because I wasn't going to study for anything anyway. And my parents got called into school several weeks later, and my parents were told that I tested in the gifted range in math. And I will never, ever forget this. My father came home. I was asleep. He woke me out of bed, sat me in a chair, and basically told me that he now had scientific proof that I was lazy, okay? Because I can't say that I'm stupid, because the nun just basically told him that I was a genius in math, so I've been found out. The party's over. I'm not applying myself. I'm an underachiever, wasting my talent. All of these things that these kids hear on and on and on. Okay. The behavior I was talking about earlier is not an excuse, or ADHD is not an excuse. What it does is really help us understand why these things happen and see what we can figure out to do to prevent them from happening tomorrow. That's the value of this type of analysis, okay? It's not an excuse for bad parenting. However, having said that, the way you parent your child with ADHD does matter. It's something that they grow out of, okay? Now, the problem is, from what I understand, years ago when they thought this was a hyperactive boy thing, many times, not always, the hyperactivity decreases substantially after they go through puberty. So a lot of people thought, since that was the outward symptom that they would see, that they kind of grow out of it. Plus, people think of it as a maturity issue, okay? In 65 to 70% of the cases, it's a lifespan disorder. All of these other things happen, okay? When I run out of medication, I swear I think my wife's going to throw me out a closed window, because that's how upset she gets when I forget things or I'm late for things. She actually introduces me to people as her late husband. That's how bad it can be sometimes, okay? So now, it's not just hyperactive boys. There are a lot of studies that have been done on females with ADHD. There is a woman who is actually a friend of mine and who is a mentor, and she is wonderful. Her name is Patricia Quinn, and she really has led the field in research on how ADHD impacts women. More often than not, girls will be inattentive, but there definitely are hyperactive girls. Okay? It's a product of our fast-paced, short attention span society. Okay? And this is how I answer that question. Yes, it is a short attention span society. We live by the 30-second soundbite. However, it's a difference in the chronic nature and the degree of the impairment. That's what you have to think about, okay? There's a difference. There's a huge difference between having a chemical imbalance in your brain that determines clinical depression that has to be treated, versus sadness that we may all experience from time to time, depending on what's going on in our lives. They are two issues that can be similar in some ways, but one of them, but based upon the chronic nature and the degree of the impairment, really is something that has to be medically treated. That's what we're talking about, and that is the difference between ADHD and our society. Okay. Now, I talked before about what happens that where parents wanting to protect their children. I'm going to go into the anatomy of a SEPTA meeting. For those of you who don't know, SEPTA is Special Education PTA, all right? And I speak at SEPTA meetings all over the country, 365 days a year. And typically what happens is, well, that's a meeting. Typically what happens is, the first 10 minutes they have the business of the SEPTA, and then they announce the speaker. But 90% of the 10 minutes of SEPTA business are questions like this. Where do you lock up the IEPs, and who has access to them? Does my son's homeroom teacher have to know that he's got ADHD? Okay, who has to know that my son has an IEP, an individualized education program? Those are the types of questions that happen at these meetings. In fact, it's so bad. I spoke at the Homick School in Mamaroneck a couple of years back, and they were filming like we're doing tonight. And when I got there was about 75 people there, and everybody was really upset. And I said, what's the problem? The parents who came to the meeting were afraid the camera might catch the back of their heads, and people would know that they had a kid with special needs. So the entire night was a close-up on me above the waist, like Elvis on the Ed Sullivan Show. Okay, it was, and I felt bad for the cameraman because he had to follow me around because I move. And so that is a problem. The next night, I spoke at my son's school district. And when I got there, the woman said, thank you for bringing the handouts. Can you bring another, like a double amount of handouts for me tomorrow? And I said, why? She said, I got a lot of calls from parents that wanted the information, but they were afraid if they came to the meeting, other parents of kids with special needs would know that they were at a meeting for kids with special needs. That's a problem, okay? That's a huge problem. I know you want to protect your children from these stigmas, but by that mindset really perpetuates this type of stigma, okay? And trust me, especially kids with ADHD are extremely perceptive, okay? And secrecy breeds shame, okay? Just remember those words. It's really important. Okay, how parents make it worse, secrecy. I'm protecting my child from stigma. Special education is an ugly term. ADHD is an ugly label. It makes me look like a bad parent. I won't take my child to a psychiatrist because people will think he's crazy. Okay? Problems with these. Secrecy breeds shame. ADHD so permeates their sense of self-esteem. That's what you can't see. That is the invisible part of this disorder, okay? And I know because I'm one of them, okay? When I see frustration in those kids' eyes, I've been there, and I still live it today. They will not get the support they need if you are afraid to stand up and advocate for them and involve them in the process. Because at some point when they go on to post-secondary education, to college or community college or vocational training, they're gonna need to self-report their disability and document it and stand up and articulate their needs and ask for services. And if you're doing it for them and you're keeping it from them, first of all, it makes them feel bad about themselves because it's the big secret that you're going to school to talk about me. The one thing I can tell you, and if you take away anything from tonight, the most important thing is talk to your kids. Put them in the middle of this process. Let them drive the special education process. It's tremendously empowering for a kid that has a problem with their sense of self-esteem. Most pediatricians are not qualified to diagnose or treat ADHD. Parents will go to the pediatrician and say, they told me at school he was hyperactive, and the pediatrician says, well, if he's hyperactive, they give Ritalin for that. That's not a diagnosis for ADHD. There could be a lot of reasons that they're hyperactive. It could be a food allergy. It could be anything, okay? Bring your child to a neurologist or a psychiatrist, or as a special education attorney, I will tell you what's most important to me is not the label of ADHD, but it's the scores on all of those subtests so I could see what their needs are. Okay, they've got a slow processing speed. That tells me they need more time. Okay, all of the results of those tests should be a blueprint for the services you need going in, because it's not about they have a disability. It's about how that disability is holding them back. That's the nexus you have to make. Okay. Special education, this is another important thing, is a service. It's not a place. You have to get out of the mindset that the short bus comes to the house and takes them to the special ed classroom under the stairs with the bad kids, okay? The schools have a legal responsibility to provide services in what's known as a least restrictive environment. And in many cases, they actually bring the services into the classroom. They're called push-in services, instead of pulling the kids out and separating them from their friends. You gotta break that mentality. Okay, they will never be able or willing to advocate for themselves. When these kids go off to college, I'm telling you because I've spoken to many of them, they believe that ADHD is something that their parents told them they had and made them feel broken. And when they go off to college, they don't want to talk about ADHD. They just want to fit in. They just want to be like everybody else. The last thing they want to do is go to the disability office and self-report. You really have to start teaching self-advocacy at a young age. Okay, self-esteem. Everybody's a genius, but if you judge a fish by its ability to climb a tree, it will live its whole life believing that it's stupid, okay? And from what I understand, Albert Einstein had a learning disability himself, so he was probably, I hate to say it, no Einstein when he went to school. But it really does put, I think, a face on the fact that these kids are constantly being judged. They're constantly being told, you should be able to do this, you're not doing this. All of the feedback that they get is negative, and that's a problem. Okay, how do we tackle stigma? Most powerful force in the universe. What we have on our side is the biggest secret weapon in the entire world. The most powerful force in the universe is a mom on a mission, okay? I've dealt with a lot of them. It's so important. That is what changes things in life. CHAD, this huge organization, started out as a mom's movement in Florida back in the 80s, okay? So think about that. You can do it. They're your kids. Tackling stigma. Educate yourself with accurate science-based information. Join the disability community. Join organizations like the CEC. Join organizations like CHAD, ADA, NAMI, whatever it is, for a couple of reasons. Number one, they provide excellent information. Number two, they provide you and your children with a voice in Washington. I used to chair CHAD's Public Policy Committee, and we really made some major accomplishments with the rest of the disability community on the Hill, okay? And most importantly, when you go to a meeting like tonight or at one of these organizations, there is an enormous amount of comfort in knowing that you're not alone. Okay, that's really important too. Everybody is in the same boat. The symptoms may be a little different for your kid versus my kid, but you're not alone, and that's really important. Talk openly with your kids about ADHD. I'll tell you a very quick story. I am very open about my ADHD, okay? And I try to do that as part of this movement to attack stigma. And my son has known what ADHD is for many years. And what was funny was I was putting him to bed one night, and that was our 20 minutes that we would kind of talk about our day and everything. And he seemed upset. And I was like, what's the matter, Robert? Now, I think that Robert has inherited my special way of looking at the world. However, he's a lot smarter than I am, and it never really held him back in school. There were other issues that we were working on with him. But he said to me, Dad, do you think I have ADHD? And I said, I really don't know. So far, it's not a problem. If it is, we'll look into it. He's like, well, what if I don't have it? I said, it doesn't matter. You're still you. And he seemed upset. And I said, what's wrong, buddy? He's like, well, what if I don't have it? He said, what if I want to be a lawyer like you? Don't you have to have ADHD to be a lawyer? And I said, no, sometimes it helps. But, you know, I mean, that was how open we were about, you know, what I do and what it's all about. And I really encourage you to involve your kids. When you say to a 10-year-old, what's the hardest thing about school? When parents come into my office, I make them bring the kids and I ask them to leave. And I sit down with them and I say, what do you hate about school the most? And then we see what we can work on. Okay. Teach them to advocate for themselves, involve them in the process, bring them to the meetings as, you know, age appropriate as it is, definitely the transition planning meeting. Actively involve them in the advocacy process, educate their teachers, educate friends, family, community, and the public. That's the only way things are going to change. Discuss multimodal approaches. Medication, I take medication. I'm not advocating for medication. It's a personal choice. But you can't think of medication as a magic bullet. It doesn't cure ADHD. When it works, and it usually does, it is a useful tool to help them make positive changes in their lives. But they have to make those changes with educational support, coaching, exercise, etc. Really quickly about ADHD coaching and empowering students to succeed. It's a unique thing that's been going on. It started for adults. It's now moved into working with students. A coach, just like a tennis coach would be, that coach can't manufacture talent in their athlete, okay? But they can help the athlete recognize that they're stronger on one side versus another side. Play to your game, okay? It is a partnership between the student and the coach. There is no judgment, absolutely no judgment whatsoever. It's completely student-driven and talent-based, okay? It's very important to have them understand the talents that they have and work from there. The coach and the student, first of all, the student sets goals, not their parents' goals, not the coach's goals. These are their goals themselves. Then they and the coach together plot a course to achieve those goals. And along the way, the student and the coach kind of hold the student accountable to what they've committed to doing. And if they don't, let's just figure out what happened here. Maybe we'll try something else. Maybe this sheds some light on why it didn't work. It's a very constructive process, and it can be incredibly empowering for children, or well, adolescents, I would say, and also it gets you as a parent out of the loop. And it's a stress release valve in many cases, okay? I used to run an organization called the Edge Foundation that has a network of over 100 coaches around the country. Got some information about them, and also in the resource directory, there are other places you can go to find out about ADHD coaches, where they get their training, etc. I would recommend, if you're doing it for a student, first of all, they have to buy into the process. So they have to, you can't push it, okay? And the other thing is that you want to make sure that that coach has experience working with adolescents. Okay, conclusions. Talk to your children about their disability. It's a real part of who they are, but it doesn't completely define them, okay? Think about what you say and how you say it. And this is very careful. A lot of parents do this trying to kind of mend fences. And they'll say things like, oh, mommy lost her keys today. Maybe I have a little bit of that ADHD too. what you're essentially saying is, I did something incredibly stupid, so I'm like you. And that's not a good message that you want to have, okay? So just take your time and think about, you know, the tone of what you're saying and what it is. ADHD, LD, or any disability is not related to intelligence or sanity, okay? Every one of the students that I represent has been incredibly bright, okay? So much so that some of them actually intimidated me. And I can tell you my own personal perspective. As a kid, I was enormously frustrated that there was a lot more going on behind my eyes than I was getting credit for. And that was the source of enormous frustration for me, okay? Different isn't better or worse, it's just different. Children learn, people process information very differently, okay? And in terms of different, I just like this picture. Anyone can be cool, but awesome takes practice. I just think it's a great picture. Now, the last thing I will leave you with before I actually turn this over to the experts is I wrote a poem many years ago to try and express that frustration that a lot of these kids feel at not being understood, okay? And I'm just going to share this with you. It's called The Wonderfulness of Me. If you took all of the things that were special about me, you could put them all together and call it ADHD. No better, no worse, just different, that's me. I'm really not crazy, please try and see. Like a talented wizard in a world full of muggles, it's no wonder all you'd see is frustration and struggles. As I daydream and drift, you think no one's there. But nothing could be further from the truth, believe me, I swear. I see your impatience as my mind starts to wander, but you don't know the depth of the thoughts that I ponder. For creative thinkers get lost in deep thought, which leads to the illusion that they cannot be taught. I know trying to reach me can give you the blues, but I wish for just once you could walk in my shoes. To see things through my eyes, you would be amazed at the speed and sheer volume my thoughts seem to blaze. I'm not lazy or stupid, if only you knew how truly difficult it is to limit myself and think like you do. But I can see things that you'll never see. It's like second nature because I am me. With lightning fast reflexes, I can switch gears. To be firm and inflexible is the worst of my fears. I'm calm in a crisis and know just what to do. For I'm in great company. Mozart, Edison, and Churchill, to name just a few. So show me some patience as I'm patient with you. Just a little tolerance, it's long overdue. Please try and understand me, along with my ADHD. It's a very big part of the wonderfulness of me. And that's it.